trapped in the attic on Halloween. On Halloween, the attic kept Evelyn. She had come back to clear her aunt's things and had stayed too late cataloging boxes by the light of a single lamp until a loose board gave, the ladder shifted, and the hatch closed with a precise domestic click that became a verdict. Outside, children laughed and the neighborhood breathed in candy and costumes. Inside, above the soft thump of distant footfalls, the attic exhaled dust and something almost like patience. The house felt itself awake in a way Evelyn had not anticipated. At first, she treated the trap like a nuisance. She rattled the hatch, tugged at the ladder, tried the phone no bars, then a drained battery like an accusation. The house answered with other things, the soft, mechanical heart of a grandfather clock that did not move, a creak that could be a name, and the way the air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and burnt sugar. Evelyn laughed once sharply, because laughter is a tool, a thin blade against a dark thing. It did not cut very far. Silence returned, patient and exacting. She wandered the attic with the steadiness of someone making a list. Boxes labeled holidays, mementos, recipes, her aunt's neat, looping handwriting appearing like a map. A tin full of buttons, a stack of old maps, and the wooden doll that watched her from the corner with button eyes that were not cruel, but very attentive. Evelyn thought of memory as a thing you could sort and shelve. Each item suggested a life in parts, as if someone had taken a person apart and stored the pieces by season and sentiment. She found a shoebox tied with twine and opened it with the careful reverence of someone untying a memory. Inside were letters in familiar handwriting, hers, or almost hers, slanted and patient, with dates that didn't line up. The ink bled in places like rain. A note on top read, in a hand she could have sworn was her Aunt S. For the nights you forget. Evelyn read a single line aloud and felt the attic rearrange itself to listen. The house folded its ears to her voice and returned a whisper back that might have been a syllable from one of those letters. Time blurred. Halloween beyond the roof became a softened, distant thing, porch lights flickering like sentries, laughter a low tide heard through wood. In the attic, the clock remained stubbornly stopped at midnight, though a small, private sound ticked where the clock face should have been in the pause between her breaths. The attic began to show her things she had misplaced emotionally. A photograph of a child she could not name, a recipe card with a pressure mark from a thumb, a pressed leaf that smelled faintly of a park she once loved. Memory was being rearranged into a proof she could hold. When the house stopped being just a house, Evelyn felt watched by the idea of people rather than the people themselves. Footsteps above would be only the settling of rafters. Laughter might be a memory folding in on itself. She found a key on a ribbon tucked in a drawer, cold as a hidden coin. On the shaft were faint initials she didn't recognize. The key fit a small brass lock on a trunk she had overlooked. Inside, a journal in a hand, both younger and older than her detailed nights spent writing to someone who would forget and return every October. Page after page, the journal spoke in a voice that shifted like light across a wall. Sometimes the speaker was her aunt, sometimes a version of Evelyn she could have been, sometimes a stranger who called themselves the keeper. They wrote of preserving what people discarded: promises, dwindled laughter, the exact timbre of a child's hiccup clipped from a recording. The keeper wrote of the attic as a careful room where things that would otherwise vanish could be visited again, but only by the house's invitation. The writing was not wholly kind, and it was not wholly uncaring either. Evelyn tried to think herself pragmatic, a woman who could box memories clean and label them for later. But the attic eroded pride along the edges. It asked questions without mouths. Which past will you choose tonight? How tightly will you hold? At one point, she found a mirror with its surface mottled and dull. When she lifted it and leaned close, the reflection didn't obey the small, practical gestures she made. It hesitated, turned its head a fraction late, smiled a half-beat before her. For a heartbeat, she understood the attic's true talent. It kept echoes in place long after the original sound had moved on. A low wind pressed at the small window, and the house answered by tightening around her. From somewhere below came the muffled sound of a radio playing a Halloween parade of old ads and children's songs. But when she crept to the edge of the hatch and peered down, the living room was neatly empty and lit, as if waiting for someone to return. There were candies arranged in small bowls, unclaimed, and a carved pumpkin with an expression too deliberate to be accidental. Evelyn felt suddenly like a guest who had missed the main course and was left with the aftertaste of someone else's appetite. She tried the hatch again at intervals that felt like rituals. Breathe, listen, pull, wait, speak into the dark. Sometimes she could almost coax the house into ordinary noises, a thud that suggested a person crossing the hallway, the clatter of a kettle. But the sounds always dissolved into something else. A whisper of her aunt's laugh that threaded into the tick of the stopped clock. A creak that answered with the cadence of a story she only half remembered. The attic seemed less a place than an apparatus that smoothed edges and rewired motives until every memory fit neatly into its grooves. By the small hours, the attic's patience grew thin and precise. Shadows sharpened like pens, and the air cooled to the texture of cloth. Evelyn found herself speaking to the house as if it were another person, asking questions she did not expect to answer. "Who are you keeping for?" she asked, knowing memory doesn't always answer. The house replied in a way that wasn't quite sound. Photographs shifted on a board. A single page turned from the journal without fingers. The attic had the businesslike efficiency of someone who archives souls one by one. At the edge of fear, Evelyn discovered a strange comfort. The attic's keeping was a perverse kind of mercy. Forgetting was lonelier than being remembered in a box. She sat cross-legged beneath the clock and began to speak aloud passages from the letters, reading the names and recipes and small admissions until the attic answered with recognition that felt like warmth. It was dangerous, this exchange, but also tender. The house did not demand perfection, only presence. For a moment, she was both archivist and archive, holding histories like fragile glass. Then the attic offered her a choice without pronouncing it. In a corner, she found a small door she had missed, painted the same faded cream as the beams, and fitted with a tiny brass lock. The key she had found earlier trembled in her palm, as if it contained a heartbeat. The journal had hinted at this sort of exit in a line about doors that admit and doors that keep. Evelyn understood the calculus instantly. She could unlock the tiny door and step into something smaller and colder, a place to put the parts of herself she wasn't ready to carry. Or she could climb down and let the house keep the pieces that would otherwise break on the walk home. She paused because every real choice clarifies the shape of a person. Downstairs, the world continued in its imperfect, luminous chaos, costumes, neon pumpkins, thin music. Up here was the promise of preservation and the slow erasure of spontaneity. Memory as museum, memory as mausoleum, both felt true. Evelyn's breath fogged the space between wanting to run and wanting to stay, and she realized the house had been waiting for that fog to clear. The attic did not plead. It only held its objects up to the light and asked quietly which versions of Evelyn would be allowed to leave. Ultimately, she lifted the key and turned it. The tiny bolt gave with a sigh, like something settling into place. The door opened onto a short, impossibly narrow corridor lined with shelves full of jars, each labeled in the same looping hand: a laugh, a name, a birthday. Inside one jar floated a slip of paper with the smell of her childhood faint as mothballs. Inside another, the cadence of a voice she had not heard in years. The corridor did not smell like dust so much as remembrance. She understood why people come to museums, not to be instructed, but to be recognized. She reached for a jar labeled "Only Tonight," and the attic gave her a memory so bright it nearly hurt. The scent of a hand-rolled apple pie, the exact curl of a laugh that belonged to someone who used to tuck a blanket around her knees. Evelyn held it like a fragile thing and wept without shame. The house did not force her to keep it. It only offered it the way a drawer offers a photograph to be looked at again. When she set the jar back, the memory hummed in the space between the floorboards and the moonlight, faithful and waiting. She climbed down when she was ready, or perhaps when the house decided she had been ready long enough. The hatch felt heavier going the other way, like a lid placed over a jar. Outside, Halloween had the familiar buzz of neighborhood revelry, but something was off in the margin. A lamp that flickered in a rhythm she found oddly familiar, a neighbor's costume that seemed to repeat a posture from a photograph in the attic. Evelyn realized, as she stepped onto the porch, that the house had not so much kept her as rearranged the edges of the world to make room for what it had preserved. She went home carrying a jar with the lid askew. Later, long after the porch emptied and the pumpkins glowed their last, she sat at her kitchen table and opened the jar by the window. The memory inside unfurled like a small film, bright, immediate, and oddly merciful. It did not answer every question. It did not mend everything that was frayed, but it offered a particular, precise consolation. Things could be kept without being owned, remembered without being imprisoned. Outside, somewhere on a street decked in plastic ghosts, a child laughed in the exact pitch she had heard in the attic. Evelyn listened and could not tell if the sound belonged to the living world or to the warmed glass she cradled, and that not knowing lingered like a good story.